Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Water for Tomorrow workshop. Please note this is being recorded. For those who don't know me, I'm Jane Birch, a trustee of the Essex and Suffolk Rivers Trust. I'm standing in for the Rivers Trust Director, Brendan, who sadly is very poorly at the moment. If you're not familiar with the Water for Tomorrow project, I'm not going to talk about it now because Hugh is going to talk about that in our first presentation. So with the help of the sort of technical wizardry of Hawk AV and Chris, I hope we can all have a very interesting and afternoon with everybody participating. Next slide. Just a few, not rules, but just to remind you, keep your microphone on mute until you get to the breakout sessions. There is a raise your hand facility that you can use when it comes to questions. I will do my best to get as many questions answered as possible, but it may not be possible to get to everybody, but there will be opportunities through the chat to be able to list your ideas and further questions. So next slide. Right, so we have our programme includes some very thought-provoking speakers this afternoon. Each of those will be followed by a short question and answer session. We'll then have breakout groups, which is where you do all the work. And then we will come back together after those, just hear what the other breakout group said, move on to the next presentation and repeat it until we get to the end of the afternoon, and we will be finishing at 5 o'clock on the dot. As I say, Zoom has this chat facility. Please use this if you have any views and certainly any questions that we don't get round to answer. Presentations, summaries of the breakout groups, comments and questions that have been left will all be available after today on the Water for Tomorrow website. And the details of that will be following up later. Next slide. So when you registered, we asked you a couple of questions, and there are 3 slides. They're pretty self-explanatory, and I don't think there's any surprises here. It's a hugely important subject, water resources. Next slide. And you know, it matters to a lot of people. And not everybody feels they've got the answers yet, which is why we've all come together today. Next slide. And the impact obviously is huge, both on businesses and on water for all of us as individual persons and for the natural environment. So it's a hugely important topic. Seems a bit odd when at the moment half the country is under flood conditions, but it just illustrates the need to join up both water resources and flood management. So let's get started. Next slide. Just some ideas as to why we're all here. I'm sure you all know why you're here, but these are the sort of what we hope to get out of this afternoon. And we will say more later on, but just to remind you, this is the first of a number of workshops on this topic, and you'll hear more about that later. Next slide, just a few definitions. I've asked the speakers not to use abbreviations if they can help it. We do have a lot of issues with which particular quantities people talk about. So we've just put a few things up here that might be helpful. If you need any other clarification, just put it in the chat and somebody will answer that for you. So let's get started. We've got a busy afternoon. You don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from our speakers. So I'd like to invite Hugh and Harry from the Environment Agency to get us started. They will obviously talk about what the Water for Tomorrow project is about and start us on our journey this afternoon. You'll hear more from me later.
Thanks, Jane. Next slide, please. We have a poll. Yeah, so what's proportion of Eastern England have been classified as serious water stress. If you could vote, please, 50, 100 or 75. I think I've got to do that too. Better not get it wrong.
Sorry, Hugh, I forgot about the poll.
No problem. Hopefully you can see results, Jane. I can't see anything yet. There we go. Okay, so it's a surprising range: 6% 50, 51% 100, 43% 75. So half of you correct. The correct answer is 100%. Yeah, all of East England has been classified as water stressed according to the Environment Agency, which leads nicely into the presentation. Next slide, please. So some of you will have seen a couple of slides this morning. Harry and I presented to East Suffolk Water Abstractors Group. So apologies for repetition, but for others, it's important to run through what Water for Tomorrow is. So as the name suggests, I'm Hugh Richards. I'm the project manager for the Environment Agency, the Water for Tomorrow project. Harry Condy is the water resources specialist, and you'll hear from her shortly. And we also have a new starter on Monday, Mahmood Tabakjali, who is going to do some data and monitoring for us. And Rory Callan supports us as a senior advisor in the national team. Next slide, please. So at its heart, Water for Tomorrow is a partnership project. It is funded by Interreg, EU funded, for 2 years from March 21 to March 23. So we are about halfway through, unbelievably. There are 5 partners. So the lead partner is the Rivers Trust, Corey Fadiero being the project manager. Water Resources East, Mari Barnes is the project manager and I believe is on the call, myself and Harry. And we have 2 French partners in BRGM and Cabelair. The 5 catchments of interest you can see on the map. So the UK ones, we're focused in Broadland, East Suffolk, hence us presenting to East Suffolk Water Abstractors Group this morning, and the Cam and Ely Ouse. I'm not going to try and pronounce the French catchments. Next slide, please. Okay, so at its heart, the project is kind of a communication and engagement project at its core. And that is for us all, every single sector, every single individual, to understand what the problem is. And that problem, as already alluded to, is water shortage, which, as Jane says, is always strange talking about when some of the country is under flood water. But before we know it, we'll be into summer and we'll be talking on the opposite side of that coin and saying, where is all the water? So we've used the analogy, famous analogy by French philosopher, author of The Elephant and the Blind Men. So if you put a number of blind men in front of the elephant and ask them to say what they feel or what they can touch, they will come to many different answers. So our goal is to break down those barriers and all agree that there is a water shortage. So it's encouraging that 97% of registration said they are aware of it. We may ask that again in the breakout rooms after this presentation. So once we all understand the water shortage problem, and importantly the magnitude of it, I think only then can we all start to work on and agree a shared solution. Everyone's going to be affected. We've heard comments about one sector may be favoured over the other, or one sector taking the majority of the cuts. You'll see shortly that is not the case. Everybody, and I say everybody, in every individual and every sector is going to be hampered, want of a better word, equally. And only then can we innovate and adapt in light of that water scarcity. I think innovate, we all use it really loosely, and it's a really hard thing to do. So it'll be interesting people's opinion later on how we as a whole can innovate. I'm going to pass over to Harry Condy for the next 4 slides. So over to you, Harry.
Hiya, thanks, Hugh. So why are we here today? Well, only 3 and a bit years ago, between the 1st of June and 16th of July, the UK received just 47 millimetres of rain during the longest heatwave in Britain in 42 years. And this photo you can see here was in every newspaper and shows the scale of the change geographically during that heatwave. So you go from lush, vibrant green in May on the left turning to arid brown within 2 months on the right. And working in the environment planning team at the time, we found ourselves having to tell abstractors to stop taking water because we were in a drought situation, and it was an uncomfortable situation for us all. Next slide, please. So what does the future look like for East Suffolk and the wider region? Well, the Office of National Statistics has forecasted that the population of the East will increase to 6.5 million, or by 5%, which is in line with the 5% increase in population of England as a whole. There's also going to be, and is, a much higher public awareness of the environment and environmental degradation. And there is the potential that there will be more stringent legislation for all water users. And then there is climate change. The Met Office projects that the UK will see warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and more frequent intense weather extremes. And in the East, under a scenario of 4-degree temperature rise by the turn of the century, rainfall is projected to decrease by 39% in summer, but increase by 35% in winter. And in terms of flows, low flows are projected to be 81% lower, but peak flows 35% higher. So what do these different pressures mean? Well, it means there's going to be an increased demand for water. A growing population means more food and services. And then there's reducing supply. So we have lower flows at times of peak demand, with more water required by the environment, and increased restrictions on abstraction. Next slide, please. So who needs water in East Suffolk? Well, in East Suffolk, at the moment, based on current levels of abstraction, over 43,500 megalitres of water is abstracted per year. And that's the equivalent to 119 megalitres per day, or 26 million gallons. Now, half of this is licensed for drinking water, and a quarter is licensed for agricultural purposes, 90% of which is for spray irrigation. And geographically, spray irrigation is more concentrated to the coast, where the soils are light and free draining and ideal for growing root veg. And then as you move inland, soils become heavier and non-irrigated crops become the major crop. And in these inland areas, more water is licensed for industry. Next slide, please. So I appreciate this is a very busy slide, but it includes some important information. So the latest WRE modelling has forecasted that we will need to find an additional 2,267 megalitres per day. That's the equivalent of 499 million gallons in Old Bunny. And we need to find that by 2050 under a worst case scenario. For reference, that's roughly twice the water we currently use. Even under the best scenario, there's still a deficit of 703 megalitres per day, or 155 million gallons. So this should really be a red flag to all of us. So in the table in the middle, you can see how this deficit breaks down, with the vast majority of this extra water we need to find being needed by the environment and public water supply. But we also have the largest demand for non-public water supply sectors in the country, and irrigated agriculture will need an additional 13 to 48 million gallons per day. So the one sure thing we know is that there will be less water for all of us. On the right-hand side, you can see a donut diagram, and this shows how much water could be supplied by new large-scale strategic supply options. However, these aren't enough to meet the deficit that's shown in that red flag. So there's lots to do in demand management, and we need to work together to develop catchment level schemes that will help address this shortfall. Back to Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Next slide, please. So just putting this slide up again, Harry's already told you the figures about how much less rainfall we will have in winter and how much more we'll have in winter, alluding now, to the Severn reaching its bank level. Next slide, please. But they are all predictions, and I think we also need to prepare for those extremes that seem to be more and more of a recurring event. Certainly in East Anglia, based on the EA's hydrological summary, January 22 was the 5th driest month in the beginning of record in 1891. Just 17 millimetres of rainfall fell, which is 34% of the long-term average. So we have this perception of climate change giving us more rain in the winter, but that's not always going to be the case. Fortunately, in that example, we've had storms and what have you recently that has made that situation better. Also had the hottest day in the UK just 2-3 years ago, almost reaching 40 degrees. And some of us remember, almost basking on the beach on New Year's Eve. It's the hottest New Year's Eve on record. So things are changing and we need to act. Next slide, please. So working for the Environment Agency, Harry and I, we've always had a yes if attitude, and we strive to be that pragmatic regulator looking for solutions. But for the first time, myself and others are saying no to development plans because there simply isn't the water to support them now, let alone in 2050. It's the first time we find ourselves having to say no to abstraction applications for the same reason. And some of you will be well aware, James Bevan, my boss in 2018 in The Guardian, had his jaws of death statement. In about 25 years from now, we will not have enough water to supply our needs. So things are moving on. That's 4 years ago. So we're 20% of the way there. We all have to change our relationship with water to stop this happening. So how importantly do we apply yes if to the project and everything we're discussing today? Next slide, please. Few questions for you to ponder, and the last one particularly for breakout rooms. Can we provide access to water? And you'll see all highlighted throughout. Yes, if we all understand and agree that there is a problem, the elephant, that it can only be fixed if we all work together. Can we make our businesses more resilient and protect the environment at the same time? Yes, if we think differently, innovate, adapt and share water more efficiently. And the next one, I won't try to answer, but maybe we can all think about this in the breakout sessions and the problems. In the future, will there be enough water for everyone? Yes, if ... Thank you very much for listening. Next slide.
Thank you, Hugh. Food for thought, I think. It's not a cheerful picture. We all know that. That's why we're here. Has anybody got any questions or comments that they'd like to make to Hugh at this stage? And Harry. Sorry, Harry. I can't see anybody's hands up at the moment.
I think these slides have been seen a lot, so we might stun people into silence and we want to start talking about solutions.
Right. Mark Andrews has got a question. Mark, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Hugh, on that point you made about saying no to development. Is that the predictions you put there? Do they assume that we are saying yes to development going forward? And is that possibly part of the solution, where we've got wetter regions of the country? Could they take a greater share of that development in order that leaves us more headroom here for agriculture, which is obviously a speciality of this area?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think it's a very good question in terms of other areas taking it on. We're saying no to development based on that there isn't water available, or there isn't any glycable water available. That's not to say we can develop in different ways. So see more, rainwater harvesting, more grey water. So it's just about possibly how we do develop and doing it more efficiently with the water that is or may be available in different places. But yeah, it's a really tricky conundrum to be in.
Just to come in on your question about different levels of growth in those estimates, Mark. WRE have used a range of different scenarios, including different levels of growth, to forecast this deficit. So in that table, you can sort of see the lower and upper results from those range of scenarios.
Richard Rinch, welcome Richard. Would you like to ask your question, please?
I can get unmuted, yes.
We can hear you, Richard.
Thank you. Right on the East Coast, on the light land, irrigating potatoes and vegetables. Irrigation, one summer reservoir, one winter reservoir. Measuring water flows at the moment over this winter, and there are very clear multiple spikes when the water flow is high. Surely the absolute base position is that we should capture as much of this winter flow as possible. We should be helped to build reservoir, helped by the EA to be in the yes mode about abstraction licenses to use this water that is going to waste in the conditions that you are talking about a shortage. Surely it is a no-brainer.
Thank you, Richard.
There's a
I'll respond.
lot of people who would agree with you there, Richard. Not an easy one to solve though, but Hugh, your comments.
I was going to say not an easy one to answer either. I'll say my piece and bring Harry in if she wants to. But I think the first thing to say is not all of the water going to the estuaries in the winter is waste. There is some environmental considerations to be had. Most fish species are moving around in the winter, coming in, so there's an attractant flow for some migratory species. So that's just something to say first. However, one of the designs of the abstraction plan is to look at high flow abstraction. So I think you're right. If we are going to be predicting higher flows in the winter, as climate change suggests, although slight caveat on what I said about January, then there needs to be ways of means of promoting high flow abstraction where applicable. Would be my answer. I don't know if Harry wants to add anything.
Just to say, I agree. If you look at our licensing strategy for East Suffolk, the vast majority of catchments do show that there is water available for licensing in winter at medium to high flow, so capturing those peaks in flow that you've mentioned. In terms of supporting the development of reservoirs, there has been a grant this year that's currently sort of underway in terms of sort of processing those applications. I cannot speak as to whether that will be replicated, but of course we hope it is. So definitely looking at how we can support abstractors to use that winter water is something that's very high on the agenda for us.
James, I see you'd like to ask a question. Fire away.
It was just a comment, really. Obviously, I've heard quite a lot of this morning. It's been very interesting. One of my biggest worries is that the extra water we might need over the next few years, 50% or more of it is destined for environmental, which to me, if I wasn't a farmer and I understood the dilemma we're going through, somewhere along the line, somebody has to think, well, actually, what's most important here? You know, is it feeding the population or the environment? We know public water comes first because people have to drink, but they actually have to eat as well. And somewhere along the line, it seems environmental nearly comes at the top of the list, and in my view, it shouldn't do. I think the environment has to go before people starve or run out of water. It's just getting the balance right. But and the other point was we talk about there might be a little. Harry, you're right. There might be a little bit more water in the winter if somebody builds a reservoir. But actually, the predictions for climate change, we're predicting less water in the summer and more in the winter. That might not necessarily happen. I think what we really have to do is to change licenses so abstractors can take more water in times where there's plenty in the river. And that might be in the middle of August. You know, August is one of our wettest months historically. You know, if we get a downpour, you can get 4 or 5 inches of rain in August. We should be able to take it. So we need those flexibilities in all our systems to enable us to take full advantage of what's in front of us, I think. And we can't keep restricting things so badly that it nearly becomes a nightmare. Time you know, if you have a downpour and you ring up the EA and say, can we have some more water? It takes so long to make a decision that the moment has gone, if you see what I mean. So there's a combination of things there which you guys, and I know most of you want to help us get it right, but it's about putting practical things in place to take full advantage.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Very good point, James.
Yeah, on the first point, and thanks for coming back to listen again, James. I really appreciate that. On your first point about what's more important, I'll say the same thing I said this morning. I agree. I think there are some tough conversations coming our way and some trade-offs. So, you know, whether the environment is considered as important as the food production is one of them. There are many other sectors that are also going to need a share of whatever water available is available. So it's kind of that sort of sharing that context of what will happen to your business and any other. And it won't be us that makes those decisions, but I think you're 100% right. I hope those conversations carry on. In terms of the high summer water, that's certainly something we have started looking at as well. More often than not, those downpours follow a drought event or a low flow event, so there is an environmental need there, flushing flows, etc. But where that isn't the case, then on the real-time data issue, again, that is an aspiration of abstraction reform and the plan. And with our digitisation of licences, I think the aim, I know the aim, is to get to a more real-time management online, so an abstractor can go in and see exactly when that water is available. Because you're right, there is a lag, which is something we're looking to as the EA as a whole, not just the Water for Tomorrow project.
Thank you. And anybody else got any questions or comments they'd like to make? No. In which case, I think what we will do is we will move into the breakout sessions a little early, if that's possible, Chris. Yep. So you will all be assigned to a room and you just click the join button and you may then unmute yourselves to join in the discussions. It looks to me like everybody's back again. In which case, what we're going to do is just a quick whiz round each of the group facilitators and just ask for a short summary of their discussion. Obviously, we haven't got a lot of time, but who would like to go first? Hugh, would you like to go first?
Of course, thanks, Jane. Yeah, we had an interesting conversation. So I did ask the question about 97% of people being aware of the water shortage as starting the conversation. Yes, people are aware, but maybe not at the scale that we presented earlier, which is interesting. We then focused on the statement and adaptations and behaviours and restrictions. Some views that there's already enough water in the system, alluded to earlier, you know, that high winter flow. The majority want to understand the environmental needs far better than currently portrayed, because it's 50% of the future deficit. My response to being that, obviously, most of those figures will change. Most of those figures, we need better information, so hopefully that will be shared. But one eye towards 2050 on that, and we're already experiencing short-term impacts. Cost, investment came up quite a lot. There needs to be investment on an annual basis for storage options, but also that the cost of innovation is prohibitive. It's actually restricting uptake. uptake, and further funding needs to be made available for innovation. We had a water company representative, and what was encouraging from that was the future of multi-sector reservoirs. Up until now, most of the reservoirs, are just for public water supply, but there's a need for big infrastructure to be multi-sector. But some questions about how expensive that might be for other sectors taking clean water and not raw water. And then surprising was some disagreement, not massive disagreement, about how efficient we're being in a particular sector and whether we could actually be better. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, I think everybody can always be better, so there's no question about that one. Harry, would you like to feedback from our group?
Yeah, sure. So we equally had a really interesting discussion, and in terms of the problem statement, we talked about the practice and behaviour, and that the value of water will drive behaviour and change, and if it's not precious enough, you don't get that drive for change. There was also a note of caution in terms of some of the technical solutions, and that they may not apply to all types of agriculture, for example. So you need to balance some water savings with carbon costs and environmental costs of those technologies. In terms of the sort of the statement, enough water to supply the needs, there was a feeling that we need to think more in terms of water management as a whole and stop working in silos. So looking at how we can address both flood risk and water resources at the same time. When it comes to the statement around protecting the environment, it was felt that we need to acknowledge that the environment isn't just a user, but also part of the solution. So we were thinking about nature-based solutions and how that might join up with flooding and the more infrastructure-based solutions. We also think it needs to be more clear that the solutions should be truly multi-sector, collaborative and inclusive. And in terms of the public, we desperately need to increase awareness around water scarcity and water use. And in terms of the sort of final part of the statement around local innovative solutions, it was felt we need to clarify this a bit to think about what we mean by local and ensure solutions can work together over a range of scales. So, for instance, there could be a network of smaller options between different villages or parishes, but also some of these smaller scale options will contribute to the larger, wider scale solutions that are being delivered at a regional level. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Harry. Mark, you can feedback from your group?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Jane?
Yes, I can.
Great, okay. Yeah, so I think a lot of the same sort of comments as some of the others have said already. We had quite a lot of discussion around flexibility and the fact that the systems that we've got in place aren't always as flexible as they could be to help people, particularly with taking the higher flow water. One particular comment about the fact that the political thinking behind a lot of the policies that drive water resources is quite short term in terms of sort of governments thinking about their term in office rather than thinking further ahead, which is what probably is needed. And just a recognition that really, yes, all sectors have got to act, but there is really a need for strong leadership. And looking to make sure that leadership's in place maybe is a government responsibility. It may not be, but that was just, a discussion point, was that leadership's needed, although all sectors need to do something. And then there was just we talked around various possibilities for innovation, both in infrastructure, but also in maybe tariffs or the value of water. There's various different ideas out there, but we talked around whether or not those kind of incentives are required to get people to do anything. But then the other side of it was that maybe, you know, that's been tried and hasn't really worked in the past to get things to change in terms of just making it simply economic. It needs more of a culture change as well. So yeah, those were our comments.
Mark, thank you very much. Gosh, what a range of issues we're dealing with, and a range of views, and no answers immediately. Who was actually leading the final group? I think there was a little issue because Paul suddenly had a power cut. Mary, was it you?
Nancy and I did a bit of a team effort on coming in there. Sorry to everyone for the start. Oh, it's us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
We had a really great group of farmers and growers join us in the session. I've taken down some notes, but Nancy will definitely come in for things that I've forgotten. The things that have already been mentioned definitely came up in our conversations, and there was a clear link as to the timescales around any kind of innovative infrastructure and how long it takes things to develop. We had a gentleman within the group that was heavily involved with the Felixstowe hydrocycle and was talking about the length of time that took to get off the ground. So that was kind of seen as a barrier. And what we felt about the statement was that there was some we needed enablers to look at the short term. So then we started talking about the different time scales of short term needs, especially for agriculture and horticulture, and then the links or the disconnect with strategies and regional plans, so like WRE's regional plan, and we went into that in a bit of detail. There was a good discussion around changing behaviour and consumer demands, so we went down the route of importing food and exporting your environmental and water management conscience, and discuss the behavioural changes that were required and how much weight farmers and growers felt that they actually had in order to influence these behavioural changes, which there was a huge consensus that was nil. Then we went on to discuss the need for transparency over regulatory costs around abstraction licenses and where does that money go, and then there was a final discussion around whether water companies should charge a climate change levy like energy companies do to find infrastructure investment for water resources. And this sparked another huge discussion, again, that linked with behavioural change and how would people react to paying more. Like, we've had this energy, we're in this energy crisis where our bills are going through the roof, but our water bill is so tiny, and there isn't that, it isn't seen as the commodity which it really is. And how could we get it to that level in order to spark these changes? And that was my key messages that I took from the discussion. I don't know if Nancy wants to come in with anything else.
No, you've done an amazing job, Mary. Thank you.
Thanks. Back to you, Jen.
Thank you. I mean, how do I sum up that? I mean, I think we all know it's a hugely difficult issue. There is no one solution. Interesting, there's a lot of discussion about needing leadership, needing enablers, needing incentives, whether those are regulatory or financial, you know, and the fact that everybody at every level has got to understand the problem and contribute to it. I think we've now got another poll. Is that correct? Yes, another little poll before we go into the next session. Interesting. Hugh or Harry, are you going to give us the correct answer? Because nobody's given it to me.
Paul's going to give the answer in his presentation.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, don't steal my thunder.
In which case, I think, Paul, now that you're back, and I hope your power cut has been restored fully and you're not going to lose you again, if you'd like to kick off the next presentation, and we'll have questions and discussion after that. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, my apologies. UK Power Networks chose the most inconvenient time to cut us off. To be fair to them, we did have two guys in here trying to get me to mobile hotspot, but we're back online. So really what I'm trying to do in this presentation is take all that information that Hugh and Harry presented and say, okay, what does it mean here in the Anglian region and more specifically in East Suffolk. What we've got here with this slide is a snapshot of the licensing position over the past 50 years, 1970, 2000 and 2017. The circles at the bottom, the pie diagram at the bottom, is the amount of water actually licensed. And you can see, so the blue is public water supply, the orange is spray irrigation. And you can see that actually the amount licensed between 2000 and 2017 has decreased quite significantly by about 13 million cubic meters. Now that hasn't, interestingly, that hasn't been mirrored by the actual uptake of licenses. And in the past 20 years or so, that's increased by 7 or 8 million cubic meters. And interestingly, that increase has been almost entirely in the spray irrigation sector. So there's the answer to that query. Although the quantity licensed has reduced, the uptake has actually increased. Next slide, please. Now, as Harry and Hugh were saying, this isn't a sustainable situation. We can't carry on business as usual. So the agency will be looking to reduce licenses going forward. So which licenses are going to be affected? Which one's going to be affected worse? Okay, so we've got groundwater and surface water, groundwater boreholes, wells, well points, that sort of thing. These are problematic. The reason for this is that when you take water out of the ground, it doesn't matter where or when you take it. At some point in the future, it's going to impact on spring flows. It'll impact on stream flows. And often that impact is delayed a bit, and it will affect the streams. If it's taken in summer, it'll affect them towards the end of the autumn when flows are actually at their lowest. The problem with groundwater licenses is that you can't put a hands-off flow on them. So it's difficult to control the impact. Surface water, it goes without saying, if you're taking water out of a surface water source, the impact is direct. Many of our old licenses are too big. They don't have hands-off flows. And in fact, you can, if you've got a big enough license, just dewater the whole stream. You can take anything. Now looking at types of licenses. Now before the early 80s, licenses didn't have a time limit. We often called them licenses of right. Since then, we've been putting, or the agency's been putting time limits on all licenses. Now we know from the agency's abstraction licensing strategy that time limited licenses will be reviewed in 2026. But licenses of right, until now, if the agency wanted to modify or revoke those, they were obliged to pay compensation. And that could be quite hefty. But since the implementation of the Environment Act 21, the agency from 2028 no longer has the obligation to compensate you if they reduce or revoke your license. So these licenses will be coming under review. So this nice comfy feeling that we've had up till now is being taken away from us. Next slide, please. So where and how much are these reductions going to be in East Suffolk? The simple answer is that at the moment, we don't really know. The absolute quantities will depend on a number of things, including the Water Industry National Environment Programme, where the agency is looking at water industry abstractions. It'll depend on things like climate change and where license reductions in 2026 are going to happen. So we can't tell for sure. But what we have done, and this was part of the East Suffolk Water Abstractors group, the SWAG heat maps, is use agency data to model a best guess of where the impacts are going to be. And that's what these maps show. So where you have the red blobs, those are water bodies where we're seeing the worst problems. Orange, still bad, but not as bad, going through yellow and green. Where we have the red patches is where we probably are already seeing serious damage. Now, there is a health warning attached to these. The colours are based on a sort of bulk water assessment. So some of these green areas, they're green simply because the model takes into account the effect of discharges, sometimes at the bottom of catchments. If you have a big discharge at the bottom of your catchment, then the whole catchment will go green, when in fact there may be problems further up. They also don't take into account the water resources, the Water Industry National Environment Programme. They don't take into account climate change. And then there are always these tricky, unknown things around the corner. I'm thinking of the Broads, for example, where suddenly, almost out of the blue, we were hit with major reductions. You might remember, some of you, in the mid-2020s, we had overwintering birds on the estuaries, putting a moratorium on all winter abstraction. So things like this may come up. But what these maps do is they're useful at identifying problem areas. So just looking at this particular map, the one on the right, which is the coastal catchment, you can see halfway down, we've got the 100 River. Now that's red because there is a very, very large public water supply groundwater abstraction, or several, impacting on the river there. Groundwater abstraction is affecting low flows, causing serious problems. Looking further down, you can see another red blob. Now that's an interesting one because the overall abstraction in the catchment isn't particularly big, but that water body has several summer licenses which don't have hands-off flows, which means that the abstraction impact actually has an effect when it's least wanted. Now, what these maps don't do, interestingly, is tell you where there's a good resource. So if we look at the left-hand map, the bottom left green blob is the Mill River. And people who are familiar with that site know that the water company has a very large abstraction from there. And actually, there's no more water. And although the abstraction is huge, it doesn't actually cause a problem because it has a hands-off flow, which means that it doesn't necessarily impact on those flow thresholds that tip the catchments into red. Next slide, please. Now, the map I just showed you is actually fairly coarse and generic. And so the Environment Agency, Harry and Hugh, are working on this heat maps version 2, a new improved version. And you can see here, they're much more focused, narrowed down on specific water bodies, and they will actually give you much more information. So here we have a prototype of the Alden Ore. Now don't take this as read, and actually Harry and Hugh have asked us not to share it after the presentation, so we're quite privileged to be seeing it. But what these show is the current status, the water availability, and they actually give you an idea of the sort of volumes of water that need to be taken off licenses in order to secure proper environmental flows. Now expect that these, and I'm sure Harry will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're expecting these late spring, early summer this year. Next slide, please. So given that we have got reductions, license reductions on the horizon, let's have a think about the timescales. Okay, we know that at the moment, the Environment Agency is doing its best to take away unused licenses, licenses where people really aren't using them. And it's had some success because we can see that the overall license quantity has reduced over the past few years. These are in effect voluntary reductions at the moment, and we're not really hitting actual uptake. Since 2021, we've been working under the local trading and variation policy, and this affects all licenses that are traded, mostly groundwater, and anyone who wishes to trade their license will see the licenses reduced down to an average uptake. Again, this is pretty much voluntary because you don't have to trade. You know, nobody's forcing you to undertake a licensed trade, but it is another way of bringing back licenses and resources. The next big reduction in licenses will be 2026, when all of the time limited in the catchments come up for review. The Environment Agency's licensing strategy for the area is quite clear in that licenses will be reduced to the recent maximum uptake. The strategy does actually go on to say that this may not be enough, and if it's not enough, there will be another round of reductions. After that, it gets quite interesting. I mentioned the Environment Act 2021. So this, as I said, gives the agency the power from 2028 to modify or reduce unsustainable licenses. And it doesn't matter if these are time limited or non-time limited. So it means that those licenses of right may well be up for review. Now, we can't preempt what the agency is going to do. And in fact, it's sort of a bit cheeky of me to try and do that here. But if I were in their position and if I needed to make these reductions, what we'd be looking at doing is bringing those licenses of right that are causing known problems into review, targeting the biggest ones first, or the biggest problems first, and then working through the system to effectively bring them onto a level playing field with time limited licenses. So beyond 2028, we will probably see continued pressure on existing groundwater and non-time limited licenses. So next slide, please. So this presentation and this session has sort of been a lot of doom and gloom. I'm trying to put a positive spin on it with this slide. There are solutions available. We all know that. We have winter storage. There's still a huge winter resource out there that can either be with shared schemes like Felixstowe Hydrocycle or an individual farmer schemes. The slide I showed at the beginning, which showed that abstractors generally only take about 60% of the licensed quantity, means that there is, even with reductions, there is scope for resource sharing and optimization. The reason that we only take 60% or so is because perhaps you don't need it every year. Or even worse, with reservoir licenses, you may be protecting a downstream abstractor by means of a hands-off flow, when actually that downstream abstractor doesn't need the water. So there is plenty of scope for optimization, making sure that we use the resource that we know is available. And then it goes without saying, you know, there's always developments in terms of irrigation and resource use efficiency, increased use of soil moisture probes, irrigation scheduling, and other innovations. So in conclusion, I would say the situation is looking quite difficult, but unlike previous license reductions, we have got time to plan our response. And the Environment Agency, WRE, SWAG and other parties are definitely talking to each other. Meetings like this indicate that we're all on board, we're all looking for solutions. And finally, I'd say that here in East Anglia, and particularly East Suffolk, we are really good at finding these solutions. We do licensing for a lot of people over a fair bit of the country. And actually here we see more innovation, both from farmers and from the agency and groups like WRE and the Rivers Trust than anywhere else. So if there is a solution, then I would say that this is where we're going to find it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Certainly given us food for thought. Hope he hasn't depressed everybody too much. But as he said, if we all work together, we have got time to make some changes. We've now got time for some questions. Again, just put your hands up and I will come to you. If nobody's got an immediate question, Paul, I'd just like to, you talked about sort of optimization and sharing. The issue as I see it is that it's the drought year when everybody all wants it all at once. How do we try and get around that particular issue when everybody's got empty reservoirs, whether it's the water companies or farmers? We all want it all at once. You know, everybody wants to water their lawns because they're going brown. How do we overcome that particular issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the obvious answer there is that we have more storage. But even having said that, in drought years, we still don't see full uptake of licenses. So whilst this may, I mean, certainly when I was in the agency, this concept used to make me a bit nervous, but there is scope for trading that surplus bit of license. When even in a drought year, I think the uptake's something like 70%. So if we're all working, and I know the agency's working to reduce the sort of paper license, the paper water. So if we can make sure that, okay, if the licenses are reduced down, we are using that water that's available, that we know is available as efficiently as possible, either through trading or through other means, then that's going to be part of the answer. but yeah, in a drought year, that's when things really get tough.
Thank you, Paul. There's somebody called iPhone who's actually got their hand up, and I'm really sorry because I can only see half your head, so I can't see who you are either. So if you know who you are, would you like to ask your question?
Jane, it's Tim Jolly speaking.
Oh, sorry, Tim. Sorry,
no,
Tim, I can only see the top half of your head.
It didn't ask me my name when I joined, and therefore I'm called iPhone for the afternoon.
Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Can I ask Paul, what is the period that is going to be used for the next round of licence reductions, please?
Tim, I'm sorry. I think we might have to throw this one over to the Environment Agency. It's not for me to determine that policy. It may well be set out in the ALS. Perhaps Harry or Hugh could field that one.
Yeah. So in terms of the capping policy on groundwater licence, for spray irrigation, the period we use to determine your peak annual use, which is what we cap the licence to, is 2000 to 2015. For other purposes, it's 2005 to 2015. And the reason why we use those periods is because that's the period which the status of the water bodies was determined in. So we know that at the level of abstraction that was taking place between that 2000 2015, we know whether or not that was sustainable. In terms of groundwater, it was unsustainable. So we need to ensure that it doesn't deteriorate any further. So that's why we use that period. It's a baseline.
So that's obviously 10 years, it will be 10 years ago. What is going to happen to people who have since 2015 increased their usage?
If it's a new license, we'll look at the use of that license.
No.
Yeah.
Old licenses that are being used more.
Okay, so for a groundwater license, yeah, if you've increased your usage since 2015, we will still, in all likelihood, cap to the maximum you use between 2000 and 2015. And that's because we can't allow that deterioration in the status of the water body, which was determined during that period. We will try and be as pragmatic as possible, but we do have that duty to prevent deterioration in water bodies.
Me sounds a little worrying if, as a you know, a user, and I'm not going to say a farm, a user has invested heavily in expanding their business in that time frame. There needs to be some pragmatism, I think, attached to that particular decision. Sorry, just a personal opinion. Anybody else want to make got a question or a comment they'd like to make? I can't believe Paul's presentation has made everybody happy, so I'm sure you've got some things you'd like to get off your chest. Tim, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Jane. Yes, please. When
oh, sorry, Tim. Sorry, it's the other Tim, Tim
one.
Darby. Do beg your pardon. I'll come back to you.
I'm much more important than him.
Don't fight, guys. Let's have Tim Darby first.
Based on the response Harry has just given, if there is a clear justification for use at the end of a time-limited license for renewal on similar terms, and that clear justification can be used and demonstrated and linked to employment and so on and so forth, are you still suggesting that a developing business that is increasing its uptake purely because it is a developing business could be financially and everything else thrown in, basically fed to the lions?
We'd have to review that in an individual example on that. But what I would say is that we do caution against any investment based on your groundwater license, because we know those are not sustainable. And I would continue to say that message going forward. If you're expanding your business, then you need to look at the sustainability of your licenses. And the message we have put out since 2012 is that groundwater licenses are not sustainable.
And Harry, would that apply to licenses of right as well as time-limited licenses?
Oh, that's a tricky policy regulation question at the moment. But I would caution against any groundwater abstraction if you're using it as a basis for your investment. But as we have said, you know, there are changes to legislation, policy, etc., that may come in the future. So it is difficult to give certainty at the moment. But the message we have put forward to date is that groundwater abstraction in general is not a sustainable option for the future. So that so it is on your own risk to invest on the back of that.
Interesting discussions. I've got lots of comments I'd like to make, but as chairman, I won't. Tim Jolly, would you like to come back? You wanted to ask something else.
That's better. Paul was hesitant to say when individual license holders will be told what their likely reductions are in the years to come. This is not a very satisfactory state of affairs, that in 2 or 3 years' time, people are going to be cutting licenses, and they personally don't know when what the amounts are going to be. When are we going to be told individually what these license reductions are going to be?
I just jump in. I think Harry's answered the questions very, very well. I think we're steering into sort of policy questions, which Harry and I, you know, are not here, but I completely appreciate the frustration. I think what's interesting is it is a case by case example, and all those examples are asking for more water, or potentially, and I understand businesses want to develop, but what we've shown is that there's going to be substantially less water. So I think Harry's quite right in saying, you know, we would be cautious in saying for anyone to invest based on the figures that we've showed today. Tim, in answer to your question, I think we take that away and see if we can talk to people higher up than us in the EA to see how and when and what is going to be communicated to abstractors. We're doing our best with the heat maps in East Suffolk, and we're looking to roll them out in Cameo and Bowwag. So we're doing our best on what we know, but even Harry and I don't know the answer to your question.
Yeah, well, obviously heat maps are a help, but until it gets personal, individual abstractors, I wouldn't say they switch off, but they tend not to pay as much attention as they ought to. And therefore, it is absolutely vital that these things become personal. And agriculture needs a reasonable, and I'm talking 5 to 10 years time, if your license can be reduced, that you can replace it, and not the seemingly instant reductions that people seem to be talking about.
Thank you, Jim. Good point. And thank you, Hugh. I think we must remember this is part of a wider project, and all of these issues will be, we will be taken away and chewed over elsewhere. So there's a lot of policy and government involvement in this. What time for one quick last question from James, please? Then we'll move to the breakout session. If you've got questions, don't be afraid to put them in the chat. They will be looked at and answered, and you'll get answers in a follow-up on the website. So James, quick question from you, please.
Just a couple of quick ones, really. First one to Paul. Do you think the license of right will end up being challenged in the courts? Because that's what everybody says. Whether it is or whether it has any legs, I don't know. And the other thing is the EA need to understand that some of us have got long-term contracts with supermarkets and what have you, and we really need to have enough water to cover us for a season and a half or 2 seasons in case we get into a 2-year drag. If I cack up with a contract with Tesco's or one of my customers, I come back to the table the next year, they're not going to want to deal with me. If I can't come up with the goods because of lack of water, that's me done. So we have to bear that in mind when we try to reduce license volumes. Some people have large volumes because they want to cover themselves for a bit longer. But yes, it'll all come down to our customers, really.
Absolutely, James. I mean, each and every one of us want to eat the food you produce, and when the food isn't available and there's going to be a public outcry, then there really are going to be some questions, and at that stage that people will understand the importance of water. We've got a lot to discuss. I think now is the time to go into the next breakout session, where you can all continue this discussion in much more detail. So if you'd like to join your thing, and we'll see you all again together in half an hour. Right, I think everybody is now back from their breakout groups. I'm sure if you're like me, your head is starting to hurt from all the thoughts and the discussions. It's a very complex issue, lots and lots of issues to be discussed. People are full of good ideas, but there are a lot of hindrances to developing ideas. So let's just hear from our groups very briefly what the main sort of discussions were. I'm going to start with Mark this time.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so yeah, we had an interesting discussion. One of the members of our group was a grower, and he was just explaining that if he had a reduction of 10% in his license, he could accommodate that, but if it went as far as 25%, it would literally decimate his business. And we were just discussing how that, there's not a lot of margin there, and actually that there's some really, it's quite vital that we get as much information as possible as early as possible so growers can plan. This then led on to a conversation really about having a business case for change, having the right information that's needed to invest, and having a period that planning is possible, and that the amount of time we've got doesn't seem like very much. And it was also shared about the situation recently with the pig farming, with all the impacts of COVID and the impacts of Brexit, and just how some of these industries have just really struggled, not just because of resource deficits, but also just because of other bigger factors. So this is a kind of one factor on top of another. And just drawing it to conclusion, we talked about what could we do now. I mean, it's a very complex system. It's not just the grower, it's also the market as well that needs to adapt and change. But we just came to the conclusion really that all we could do at this point was to look at our own systems, to test the system and look at different scenarios and what that impact would be, and do a little bit of a desk study on each individual user to say, well, what would the impact be of different scenarios? And I think we concluded that the more information farmers and growers and users of water can have, the better they can assess those scenarios and make the best decisions they can. But the more information they can have, the sooner is the best thing.
Thank you, Mark. I think we'd all agree with that. Yeah, the right information, and time to think it through, and adapt as you can. Let's go over to Paul, your group.
Thank you. Okay, initially there was quite some skepticism about the registration survey, in that if a number of the people in the room had known about the cuts that we're talking about, you wouldn't have had 70% saying that they could adapt to this shortage. In practice, water is the major constraining factor on agriculture in this part of the world. The constraints that we're talking about will force businesses out. There'll be a massive impact on the local economy, and that impacts obviously on families, jobs, well-being. Another side issue is that the businesses that will survive will be basically agricultural, industrial agriculture, so low investment, low environmental outcomes, so we'll likely see a net negative impact on the environment. There was some discussion about parity with industry and particularly water companies, and interestingly, this wasn't necessarily about fairness, it was about the long-term planning that the water industry has benefited from over the past sort of 25 years or so. And we feel that agriculture really needs to have that long-term strategic approach and strategic conversations with the regulator. In terms of solutions, or what we need, so in terms of what we need, well, actually, let's look at solutions. These need to be local and farmer-led. And the feeling was that, okay, if we can work out how much water is available, let local groups of farmers get on with it and distribute that, or let local abstractors distribute it. But in order to do that, what we need is time. We need encouragement, both in terms of regulation and in terms of financial support. So actually more recognition from the government that irrigated agriculture is a valuable part of the economy. And we need to know exactly how much water is available and when.
Thank you, Paul. If anybody's got a crystal ball, they'll be able to answer that question, how much water is available, because it all depends on our climate and our rainfall as well as everything else. But it's a very good point. Harry, do you want to summarise our group?
Yeah, I think if I took out a few key phrases, one would be that we need to be pragmatic. We need to appreciate that schemes need to get off the ground quickly to be financially viable. And we need to think about future proofing within those schemes. But we had some really interesting discussion about risk around industries and sectors that rely on water and struggling to either secure investments from banks where licenses might be of a short duration, or where there's lack of certainty around license changes or policy changes that might come in the future, making it a risky investment for banks. And there was also scaling that up to the industry, to sort of an industry level, when you're looking at big strategic schemes, whether that be water use or energy, you need to understand the level of risk associated around water availability that's integral to those projects and the products they deliver. So it's really about understanding timescales around policy changes, license changes, and understanding the certainty you have that the resource that is licensed for your license will be available within the constraints of normal climate and weather.
Thank you, Harry. And Hugh, if you'd like to finish up with your group.
Thanks,
so
Jane.
So we can stop at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, no problem. I won't repeat anything that's already been said. I just want to say thank you to my group, because I think it was a difficult subject. So I really appreciate the honesty and candour from them. If we're looking for a high level figure about what it means to us, Tim came up with a figure of £15 million of food production lost instantly on the groundwater cuts, which is quite big. You know, others said their businesses would go out of business, and that would mean losing 120 to 130 employees. So it's not just about the water; it's about, you know, the people that are hired, and also the cost of infrastructure and machinery that has been bought to support the business but no longer be viable. So there's an ongoing cost there as well. In terms of info, yeah, no surprise, better quality of information, how much water will remain, how much will they be charged for it, nothing new there. But again, another interesting thing from Tim was about, could we estimate exactly what agriculture requires so that we could then say how much water is actually needed? So for example, you know, how much does a hectare of carrots absorb, or how much does a hectare of potatoes absorb? And the last one was, you know, much like water companies, more support from society in terms of funding to support, I'll use the plight of the agricultural community, but it needs to be promoted more what will actually happen, and then seek support elsewhere to help resolve the issue. Thanks, Jane.
Wow. What I don't really know how to sum up, because I think you've all raised so many very good points. We know it's hugely complicated. It's about regulation, it's about societal attitudes, it's about all sorts of things, some of which we feel we've got a little bit of a handle on and we've got a little bit of control over, and some things we haven't, you know, just seem too huge to manage at the moment. The most important thing is that we are all getting together, we are all heading in the same direction, we all want the same thing. And these conversations are hugely valuable. And I thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. As I said earlier, there will be summaries of what's been discussed, because obviously we weren't all in all of the groups. Any questions that have been raised or comments that have been made will be shared with everybody on the website at a later stage. And if you'd like to put up the next slide, it just reminds us that we have another workshop, 2 possible dates to do that. We very much hope that these will be live workshops. I think we can get so much more done when we're all face to face. We can have conversations in a much better way. Zoom is okay, but I personally don't like it very much. I like to see the whites of your eyes, and I think we can get some much better conversations and people talking about the solutions, which is what we've got to come to. We've all got lots of ideas, and I think, you know, if we can think of things to try locally, the Felixstowe Hydrocycle project was one example of a group of people trying to find a local solution. It's not the answer everywhere. But it's a step in the right direction, and if we all work together, we can come up with small scale and bigger scale solutions that will feed into the bigger work that the Water Resources East and the water companies are doing. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom, but it will be if we all sit in our little silos and pretend that somebody else is going to make the answer, because they're not. So I hope I will see lots of you, and probably a lot more people, on those dates in your diary. And if you'd like, put up the next slide. This is where further information about today and anything else that we're doing will be found, and we would love to keep for you all to keep in touch with us. So you know, please keep, you know, keep talking about the issue, sharing what we're doing, encouraging people to join up and join in the conversation. And all I can say is many thanks for your contributions today. Thank you for coming along, and hope to see you again soon. It's 5 o'clock. It's time for this all to shut down. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.